In this video, I'd like to talk about finding the midpoint, and specifically using what is known as the midpoint formula. So, finding the midpoint of 2 points, we will essentially be given two different points and asked to find what is the point in the middle of these. And visually speaking, you can get an idea that it's probably somewhere in there, that our midpoint has to be halfway between both A and B. So we need to come up with a strategy for how to approach a problem like this. And the general idea of this formula, so let me write it down. The midpoint formula is that the coordinate in the middle of these 2 points, A and B, well, its x value will be essentially the middle of the x values. So notice we have the two x values, -3 and 2. And the middle of those is going to be somewhere around there. You can see right in the middle. And if we look at the y values, the y coordinate in the midpoint, let me use a different color for that, is going to be somewhere in the middle, or exactly in the middle, of the two y values. And this might be a little bit easier to see. The middle of -5 and 5 will be right at 0. So notice that this will give us pretty much where our midpoint is. It should be roughly that point there. It's the middle of the two x values, and it's the middle of the two y values. So let's actually write that out. That for our midpoint formula, the x-coordinate, this will be the middle of the x values. And the y-coordinate, let me just make a little bit more room, will be the middle of the y values. So this leads us to the question, how do we mathematically find the middle of the x or the y values? And finding the middle of two numbers has to do with a concept called the average. So imagine that you're looking at test scores. And let's say that you get the scores of 90 and 100. And you want to figure out what is the middle of these numbers. What is your average? So we're looking for what we call the average of these two scores. And you might be able to think it through intuitively and realize that it should be 95. 95 is right in the middle of these. But we want to process for finding that number when it's not so obvious. And to find the average of two numbers, the general idea is that you want to add them together and then divide by 2. So this will always give you the middle of the two numbers. So you get 190 over 2, and you can see that's 95. And if you did have more numbers that you want to find the middle of, you add them all together and then divide by the amount of numbers that you're adding together. So if we had another test score, let's say an 80, then you can think the middle is 90, we would add these three together and then divide by 3, since now we have 3 different numbers. So that's the idea of finding the average, and average is another word for middle. So we can update this formula, this midpoint, using the average rather than this vague idea of middle. So we can say that the midpoint is equal to the average of the x values, and that will be our x-coordinate. And our y-coordinate will just be the average of the y values. So let's now talk very generally. Let's say we have 2 points somewhere on the coordinate plane. And we can call these points x1, y1, and x2, y2. So to find the midpoint of these 2 points, we're going to find the average of the x values and the average of the y values. And remember, when you find the average, you add the two numbers together and divide by 2. So we would take our first x-coordinate, add it to our second one, so x1 plus x2, and then divide that by 2, or cut it in half. And likewise, for the y values, we would take the first one plus the second one, and then divide that by 2. So this is our formula for finding the midpoint of any two numbers on the coordinate plane. So again, this is just written very generally. And if we go back to our problem, we can now apply that idea. We have a general idea that it should be probably about right there, but let's figure it out mathematically. So B we know is at 2, 5, and A is at -3, -5. So to find our midpoint, we are going to take the average of the x values. So we're going to add this -3 and 2 together, and we could label this if we wanted. It doesn't matter which one we call x1, y1, and which one we call x2, y2. So we're going to add the coordinates together. We do 2 plus -3 for our x values, and we'll cut that in half. And for our y values, we do 5 plus -5, and cut that in half. And we just need to simplify this. So 2 plus -3, or 2 minus 3, that is -1, and that's divided by 2, so we're at -1/2. And 5 plus -5, that's 0 over 2. And so this fully simplifies, we can move down here, to, if we want it as a decimal, -0.5, 0. So if we plot that point, we go to -1/2 and 0, that is exactly where we thought it should be. So to find the midpoint, we average the x values and we average the y values, and that will always find us the point in the middle of the 2 points that we were given.